All right, tearing into the top end on this Arctic Cat 500. We're gonna get into the top end here, the valve cover, the cylinder head. We've got the cylinder, the cam chain parts here, the tensioner. We've already removed the clutches. You should have seen the video on that. We've got the charging system over here, the flywheel and the stator. Recoil pull start is already off. I pulled that off when I showed you how to adjust the valves on this. It's a Suzuki motor, but it came out of an Arctic Cat. So you can use it for any of those machines, the Vinson 500, the Arctic Cat 500. It's gonna be the exact same motor. We've got the rear output shaft coming off here. I'm gonna show you how to remove that, as well as the front joint here. I'm gonna show you how to pull that as well. So gonna start off with the top end here. We've got 10mm bolts all the way around this cylinder head cover. That's gonna allow us to pull this off. Before we do that, I'm actually gonna remove our cam chain tensioner. We've got our cam in here, inside of our cover here, and if we pull this cylinder head cover off without removing this tensioner here, we've got potential to bind that cam and potentially break some parts, or at least tweak some of these aluminum parts in here. So, all right, we've got a 5mm Allen that we're gonna remove here, and instead of using an impact on here, I like to use these smaller wrenches to start, and then once we get them loosened up, then we can grab our DeWalt impact driver here with a socket and remove these. I like using the impacts. I particularly like the DeWalt brand. There's several other makes and models that are great, but we can either use a socket at this point or just finish pulling them out with this little L wrench here. So get that removed. I'll show you what this cam chain tensioner looks like here. You can see it kind of pushed it out of there because we've got some tension on this. So if we were to remove this 10mm bolt here, inside of here, you could take a flat screwdriver. You could actually turn this tensioner manually like this, and it's gonna be spring loaded in. So when you're going back together, what I like to do is actually take this tensioner, turn it all the way in, and then you can kind of hold it in place there. Now, you wanna make sure you don't leave it there, okay? Now we can just set it down there. Okay, if you were to tap on it like that, it would shoot that back out. Or you just take that screwdriver there, turn it out like 1/8 of a turn, it would snap into place there. This is an automatic cam chain tensioner, so it goes out, it doesn't come back in without you physically doing it. So once you get everything in position on your top end, then you can release that, spring loads out, and you shouldn't need to make any more adjustments. These do wear out. Same way with your cam chain. I'll get to that here in a little bit, but you do want to change these periodically. If you're going through the top end, I like to just replace those at that time. If you're rebuilding your motor, also replace your cam chain tensioner. They are fairly inexpensive and very, very important. Again, I'll get into that here in a little bit. Now we're going to go around and remove all these 10mm bolts on our cylinder head covers. Remove our cam adjust covers here. And then there's bolts underneath of here that you won't be able to get to these really with a socket anyways without pulling that cover, but you also have a bolt down in here. Okay, and you could maybe see there when I was pulling that up, it kind of snapped it and pulled this up. Now that's what I'm talking about. The amount of pressure on this cam chain and this cam will actually cause this to lift off of there, kind of binding this cover. So you want to be really careful. Pulling this cam chain tensioner out isn't going to completely eliminate the pressure that you're going to feel there, but it will help. And I like to remove these, otherwise you're searching for these all over the place. I'll keep these with the cam adjuster covers here, so I'll keep it with these. Now what I'll do, because it's kind of bound in there, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but you can stick anything in there, a screwdriver, a punch, anything to try to pick this up. What you don't want to do is if it's taking a lot of work, you don't want to just start cranking on this. You're going to damage your top mount here. You could potentially damage your surface here. So like that, you could also take a rubber mallet, just kind of tap either direction there to loosen that up. This is most of the time covered with not a paper gasket, but a liquid gasket. So I like to use a 1211 gasket maker to put around here, seal that up. But a lot of times that's pretty sticky when you're pulling that apart. So that's why you kind of got to use a little bit of force there. Here's your rockers here. So when you're adjusting valves, you're turning these little screws up top here. That is determining the gap between these posts here and the top of your valve here. So when you're measuring between there and there. So we'll set that aside for now, and we've got our cam ready to come out there. So we've got it loosened up. Now, more than likely, you're not gonna be able to take and just pull this off, like would be really sweet. So I'm gonna flip this around. Because there's too much pressure still on at this time. So you got quite a bit of gap in there now with your cam chain, but I don't think enough to be able to pull that cam chain off of there if your cam chain is in decent condition at all. So what I do at this point, I'll grab a flat screwdriver, and there's a little plate here that you gotta take and smash. It's a little keeper, and you gotta flatten this. Once you get it flattened, you can take, and probably gonna just be able to see one side of this cam chain sprocket. This bolt here that we removed, it's a 10 millimeter. We'll set that aside. Now what we're gonna do is turn this motor over. You wanna make sure if you're turning over up here like I'm doing, which isn't very smart, you can get your finger stuck in there. So we'll turn that over. And if you've got good compression, this is gonna be a little bit of work to do. But you turn it over far enough to get to that other bolt there, right there. Same thing, flatten this keeper. We'll grab our socket again and our impact. Zip that off of there. And we've got our bolt that we're removing. We've got this keeper here. Make sure you pay attention to that. You don't want that to drop down inside of there. Now we can remove our sprocket. We can pull our cam, and then also keep in mind you've got a keeper right here. I hope that you guys can see this. It's a little plate, keeps this cam from sliding back and forth. So I'll get this removed and show you what that is. This is the plate that I was talking about there. So sits in that journal there, and then there's a journal in the head, and those kind of work together. So once we get that off, we can should be able to pull our cam. Okay, so we'll remove our chain, then we'll remove our camshaft, and then if this is as far as we're going, if we're just doing cylinder head work, you wouldn't want to drop this chain down in here. We're actually going to go all the way down, so I'm going to drop it, that way we don't have to hold it anymore, and then I'm going to keep all these parts together here. There's really only one direction that sprocket will go on your cam. Put our spacer, we can keep all this stuff together, and then I'll just lightly screw these bolts in here. We'll set that aside. Now we've got two 10 millimeter nuts on the side here of our cylinder head, so we might have to grab a smaller socket to pull those. What I did here is grab a 1/4 inch extension, an adapter to go from 3/8 to 1/4, and then a smaller 10 millimeter. This is a 1/4 inch socket. And then we can get in there and get those bolts off of there. You could also use a wrench on there. We've got our 14 millimeter bolts here that go all the way down. So those are going to be fairly tight. I'm going to actually use a pneumatic impact here. I got an Ingersoll brand impact. Works really well. All right, now that we have those loosened up, we can take and pull those out. Now you've got a brass washer on all of these, so make sure you grab those. That way, when you flip your head upside down, you don't lose these. It's important that seals these up as well as tightens these down. So we've got our cylinder head bolts there. Looks like two different lengths of them. So these two, it looks like, are going to be a little bit shorter than those. We also have a 12 millimeter bolt coming in from the side here. That's going to hold this cam chain guide on. So grabbing my impact again, sliding that out. You can see there, it's a specialty bolt. I dropped that down in there, which is fine. I'm going to put this bolt back in there, and I can grab that guide as soon as we pull this cylinder head off. Now we have got water line here that we've removed. Obviously we've got a sensor, and that's going to come up with our head. We've got our two nuts that are off here. And the last bolt that we need, or last nut that we need to remove to get this head off of there is a 12 millimeter coming in from the bottom. So I'm going to grab a wrench here. Keep in mind you are upside down at this point, so you've got to turn it the opposite direction that one would think to loosen that up. Just regular threaded, but I want to make you aware that you're upside down. So that's the nut that we removed. Again, 12 millimeter. Now we've got 10 millimeter over here that we're going to remove. And there's 2 of these nuts over here. They're right underneath of our water line. The camera angle is not great for you to be able to see exactly where these are. All right, now we've got those 2 small nuts there. So we've got our 12 millimeter, our 10 millimeters, and now our head's ready to come off. Now, a lot of times you can just take your fist, kind of tap on it. You don't want to obviously grab a steel hammer and just start pounding on stuff. You're going to damage this aluminum head. But if you need to grab a smaller dead blow hammer and tap on it, you can do that. There is a gasket underneath of here. That would be considered your cylinder head gasket, and it's an actual gasket, not like a liquid gasket that's up here. So sometimes that'll kind of hold things up, but typically with a small rubber mallet or a little dead blow or just a fist pound, you can a lot of times pull that head off of there with no issues. So I've got oil in the top end here, which isn't a bad thing. I've got my cam chain guide here. I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to tip my head over and let that oil drain out, and then I'll show you some things on that cylinder head. We've got our piston here. This is our cylinder, obviously. We've got another guide here. Our cam chain tensioner. So this sat down in here like this. You get that bolt that's holding from the top. That cam chain tensioner actually just took and put pressure on this guide, and that would keep that cam chain tight. Now, if that cam chain wasn't tight, what would happen is you'd be out of time. So your cam would be spinning a different rate as it should be, and your valves would be opening up in the wrong places. So that is one reason why, one out of a couple reasons why you want good guides, good cam chain, and a good tensioner. And then also the other reason would be that cam needs to be timed correctly. And I've showed you that in our valve adjustment video. Make sure you check that out. So pulling both guides off there, this one's a little bit longer. It goes actually all the way down into our bottom end there, and that sits in a groove down there. Now we've got our coolant line here. I'm going to remove this hose, and then we have 2 10 millimeter bolts over here, and I believe that's it for bolts on this. All right, we've got the top clamp off and the bottom clamp off. I'm just going to actually take and remove this at this time, or at least loosen it up. That way when we're ready to pull this cylinder, it's ready to come off of here. So we have the hose pulled off of there. I'm going to grab our 1/4 inch adapter with a 10 millimeter socket on here. Grab our DeWalt impact, remove these 2 nuts here, spin those off. There's our 2 nuts. They're the same as what would be on the top, the cylinder head. So we've got this hose off of there. Now we've got our cylinder that's ready to pop up out of there. Now if our piston is not seized onto our cylinder, we should just be able to lift this out just like this. If it is seized on there, you're going to have some more serious problems pulling this cylinder off. Now if our cylinder or our piston is completely damaged, you could actually take some sort of a hammer and tap that out of there if you're replacing your cylinder. I would not suggest doing that, or absolutely don't do that if you're going to reuse your cylinder and or your piston. Sometimes taking it down to this point, all you'd be doing is putting new rings on there, and I can show you how to measure that. That'll be a separate video on what your ring end gap needs to be, and I'll show you exactly how to measure that. I'll show you how to measure your cylinder and inspect that. I'll show you how to hone this out. So make sure you look for that video on my channel. Now we're going to remove our piston here. A lot of times I'll grab a pick. So take a right angle pick or something similar to that, and you can just take and pull the circlip out. I'll just take my finger and actually stick it inside of that piston pin, because otherwise that clip, especially if you're reusing it, can go flying across the room. We don't want that if we're reusing this piston pin. If you're getting a new piston, new cylinder, a lot of times it'll come with new circlips and a new pin, but not always. Now you can just take then and push that pin out, and this pin could come all the way out. We'll pull it all the way out. You've got a circlip on this side. I'm going to actually take and put our pin back in. Our cylinder and our piston are in excellent shape. We're tearing this apart because we need to get down into our bottom end here. So I'm going to take this circlip, stick it back in. What I do is take the open end, shove it in the groove there. Make sure it's all the way in that groove. Then I'll take my pick Now we've got our crankshaft exposed here. If we need to check and see if our crank is good, what you can do is do your up and down check, your side to side check. Again, I'll show you in a separate video how to check those. When you're going back together, you want to make sure all this gasket surface area is cleaned up. Make sure there's no leftover gasket on there. This is your base gasket. So connected to our cylinder head, in between our cylinder and our cylinder head, that's called your head gasket. This is your base gasket. Now I'm going to flip this motor up. We're actually going to get into the charging system on this Arctic Cat 500 or Suzuki 500.